So quite a few years ago, I had to go all the way up to Durham for a one-day international where I was pretty sure it was going to rain, and I was a little bit disappointed with that. And it did rain. But before it rained, I saw a young, exciting Indian batter play incredibly well. And I thought to myself, he's a legit player. This is a proper player here. I was like, surely they've got to get him in the side. The player was Ajinkya Rahane.
This is the last knock. My dad refuses to tell me what this means.
These days, people spend more time working out why Ajinkya Rahane isn't perfect. In fact, they spend more time looking at what he can't do rather than looking at what he actually does. And I know why that is. It's because his overall average is, average. And that's usually what most people look at. And in Indian cricket, where there's a young batter coming through every 5 minutes with a first-class average of 50, it's easier to just go, we'll just replace him. We'll just bring in this other guy. It might be someone like Surya Kumar Yadav, who's really good in white ball cricket, and maybe that will work in red ball cricket, despite the fact that those two things very rarely link up that way. Even though he's got a first-class average of 44, which isn't that much higher than, Rahane's test average of 40. But usually the player that is mentioned when we're talking about replacing Rahane, and we seem to always be talking about replacing Rahane, is Shreyas Iyer. And I think there's also a concern amongst some of Shreyas Iyer's followers and pushers that he's 27. If he doesn't come to test soon, he might be ruined by just playing in first-class cricket. Let's call this the Graham Hick prison. Hick was Zimbabwean at the start of their journey, which means they were in the World Cup, but they weren't yet a test-playing nation, and so he thought to himself, if I'm going to play at the highest level, I'm going to have to play test cricket. And the most obvious place in those days, and still really, is playing for England. So he went and played cricket in England. For the first 8 years of his first-class career, starting when he was 17, he played 185 first-class matches. And it wasn't just in England. He obviously played first-class cricket in Zimbabwe, and then in England, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, and Australia. He actually played county cricket, Sheffield Shield, and Plunket Shield. He was in demand. He was the hottest property in world cricket. This tall Zimbabwean, stiff-looking guy who just couldn't stop making runs. He was by far the most in-demand non-international player around the world. He made 405 and completely dominated first-class attacks, and everyone wanted to see what was going to happen when he got to Test cricket. Well, in Test cricket, from 65 matches, he averaged 31. There are many reasons that this happened. England cricket was an absolute shambolic mess at that time. In fact, Hick was the white knight. He was going to save English cricket, and 4 tests later, he was dropped. Doesn't make a lot of sense. He also came into Test cricket at a time where there was just a lot of very good bowlers, and the bowlers were on top. There wasn't much respite if you're a good player. But the major reason that most people believe is that he probably just spent too long in first-class cricket. He got into bad habits because in first-class cricket, he could block out the 1 or 2 good bowlers and cash in from the rest. There's very rarely a great attack of 4 or 5 players, and certainly not regularly. That wasn't the case when he got to Test match level. All the bowlers were the best bowlers from their first-class team. He couldn't really bully them or boss them the way that he had in first-class cricket, and teams just picked him off. Had he played at a higher level when he was young, which his talents showed he should have, maybe he would have developed differently. Maybe he would have got his game ready for Test cricket rather than for first-class cricket. Who knows? Iyer is 27, and Hick was 25 when he made his debut. But Iyer's case is different, partly because Hick played everywhere and all the time. He played a comical amount of first-class games. Iyer is an incredible talent, but he's not played that much. Even if he has already made 5,000 first-class runs, he's averaging 52 with a strike rate of 80, which all sound like made-up numbers now I've said them out loud. It would be very hard to argue that he doesn't deserve a chance at the higher level. And his basic numbers are incredible. And I think he is, most probably, a magnificent talent. But it's also worth inspecting him a little bit deeper. Iyer is probably not an ideal replacement for Ajinkya Rahane, at least in part because he averages 57 when batting at 3 and 43 when batting at 4. I'm not sure that means he don't necessarily needs to bat higher up the order. He bats high enough up the order that he should really be able to bat at 3, 4 or 5 for India without too much trouble in Test match cricket. But that's an interesting stat. It means something, I think, about something. Guess? But it is interesting that he's not mentioned as a replacement for Pujara, but he is for Rahane. I think that's probably because of the 80 strike rate. He's just not seen as a like-for-like player when it comes to Pujara. But when you look at his first-class record, he's basically played a lot for Mumbai, which obviously makes sense, and a lot for India A. And that's about all. For Mumbai, he averages 54, and when he's with India A, it's 46. That's a fair drop, especially considering his best score is 202 not out, and that was for India A. And it is really worth mentioning that 202 not out, because it was against Australia, and not Australia A, but the actual, Australia team. Maybe not a full-strength Australia team, it was a warm-up game. The new ball attack didn't include Cummins. I don't think Cummins had even made his comeback at that point, or Stark, or Hazelwood. But it was Jackson Bird and Mitchell Marsh, Steve O'Keefe, who had a pretty wonderful tour of India at that time, and Nathan Lyon, who, can play. So you can't discard that innings, especially as no one else actually scored over 74 in that game. But the innings was in Mumbai. And this is where Shreyas Iyer gets really, really interesting for me. This one was in Brabourne, but he's also done well at Bandra and, of course, Wankhede. In total, he's played 15 first-class matches across Greater Mumbai. And in those matches, he averages 69. In the rest of first-class cricket that is not played in Mumbai, he averages 43. It's not terrible, but it makes his overall record look different now, doesn't it? He's only played 3 first-class matches outside of Asia, where he averages 26. I mean, I don't think we could take that too seriously, but that's part of his lower average away from Mumbai. You know who has played a lot of cricket away from Mumbai, though? Ajinkya Rahane. And not just in first class, but in tests. And way more than half of his matches are away from home. And in those, he averages 42, which is a really good record, a remarkable record. There aren't many batters who average more away from home than at home. And Rahane does that. Generally, players are really good at home and they get by when they travel. Here's my favourite example. For most of the last 15 years, if you're writing about English cricket online and you wrote about how bad England batting was going, someone from Somerset would comment about James Hildreth and how great James Hildreth is. And don't get me wrong, James Hildreth is a phenomenal talent. If you watch James Hildreth batting, looks like he's on rails. He's one of those sorts of guys. He's a really top quality batting talent. And if you're from Somerset and you spent most of your life watching him bat at Taunton, you would be quite right to think that he is an absolute god. He averages almost 50 there. Do you know where he doesn't average almost 50? Everywhere else. He averages 10 more at Hyderabad than he does anywhere else. And this is not a slight on Hildreth. This is common. Lots of players do this. But imagine England did try him. How would he have gone outside of England when he struggled even outside of Taunton? Not everyone can bat everywhere, and most players do favour home. Except for Ajinkya Rahane. Since 2010, there have been 31 players with 1,500 runs home and away. And there are plenty of players who are incredible at home. That's not always bad, it's just a thing that makes sense. But you also need players who score on the road as well. And when you look at the batting differential between home and away, no one averages more away than at home than Ajinkya Rahane since 2010. And obviously that's partly because he's underperformed at home, but that's still, just incredible. And if you just look at his away record, remember, this is the best 31 batters on the planet. These are the players who play consistently for their teams, home and away, have scored runs, home and away. He's still got one of the best away averages. He's a vastly above average away from home player. And yet, if there is ever any silence in the world, it is usually filled by someone questioning Ajinkya Rahane's place in the Indian team. And there are a few obvious reasons for that. One is the average, which we have talked about, which is partly, almost entirely down to the fact he fails to cash in when he plays at home. Another is people feel that he goes out the wrong way. This happens a lot to number 5 and 6 batters because they don't get caught at slip or go out LBW or bowled as much as other players. And for some reason, if you're dismissed LBW or caught behind, people see that as an honourable dismissal. Whereas if you get caught because Neil Wagner has put in an obvious plan, despite the fact that everyone goes out to Neil Wagner's obvious plans, suddenly everyone thinks, oh, come on now, that's silly. That's not the right way to get out. And there's also Rahane's form for the last, 3.5 years, since the start of 2018. He's been averaging 36, and before that, it was 44. That is a drop. But his drop has come at the exact same time that the entire world has stopped playing pace bowling well, which is his main skill, by the way. He's clearly another victim of the global pace playing pandemic. But he's still making important runs. He's just not making the higher end runs anymore, and that's because kind of like no one in the world is actually doing that. Right now, I would think one of the hardest things you could possibly do is just throw a young player into world cricket, because it's tough out there. It's brutal. And none of this mentions Rahane's other skills as well. You know, he obviously, from a leadership and a tactical point of view, he's brilliant to have in the team. That is why he's vice captain. I still think he's the best slip fielder in the world when it comes to spinners, and he has absolutely brilliant hands. But because this is all about average, I just want to go back to something very, very specific, and that's Shreyas Iyer's average and how it looks awesome, and Ajinkya Rahane's test average and how it doesn't look as good. Remember that Shreyas Iyer averages 44 away from Mumbai, and Rahane almost averages that away from India. That doesn't mean that Iyer isn't more talented than Rahane, but it does put his record into perspective. It changes the way you look at it a little bit. He's clearly an incredible talent, but guess what? Guess who used to be an incredible talent? The guy I saw in Durham that day, Ajinkya Rahane. In fact, let me show you even more exactly what I mean. Iyer's Mumbai average, Rahane's Mumbai average. I think this is also good for Iyer because it does show that his talent may transform even if he hasn't played as much outside of Mumbai as he could have. He is clearly a very talented player. But Rahane still has his average covered by 6 runs when they both played for Mumbai. And that's before you factor in the experience and the hands. But I think all this shows us something else, really. It's that as fans, we get sucked in by the magic 50 average. Iyer is still a magnificent prospect. Nothing I have said here changes that at all. But Rahane's test average of 40, when you work out where he's making his runs, is probably a lot better than you thought it was coming into this. Averages are a really good metric, but there's a lot more information that we need to find out. And 50 is a magical number, but it doesn't always contain everything that you need it to contain. I think if there's anything that we've learned here, it's that even the players that we think should always be dropped once started as shiny and new and everyone wanted them in the team. And the other thing is that if you're an Indian player right now and you are anything less than absolutely perfect, people will moan about you and say you should be dropped.